everyone. It is wonderful to be here. It's been a while. I was reminded that I spoke to your group in 2011, I think. And I used to come here periodically when I was in the Alberta legislature and leader of the Liberal Party in Alberta and leader of the opposition, so it's always a pleasure. And I'm particularly reminded today of a colleague, somebody you know well, and that's Joyce Fairburn, who I have known for probably 45 years and who was a remarkable senator, had a remarkable career, a 50-year career on the Hill, and was really a tremendous tribute to Alberta and to southern Alberta, and always loved this area and represented so well. She was an inspiration to me. I have the great pleasure now of talking about Senate reform. I was told that I actually talked about that last time. This time, lots has happened, and so I'm quite excited about reporting to you. I've got some points that I want to make about the process of reform and what drove my desire to see reform and I think has driven reform in many ways. But I'd like to give you some context because things have changed, and it might be worth just going over a few things to put what I'm about to say after that into context. So as Heather mentioned, there is a new structure in the Senate. There are a number of less official new structures, but this is a new structure. So historically, the Prime Minister of Canada, she or he, would appoint the leadership of his or her caucus, affiliated caucus in the Senate. So up until Mr. Trudeau removed us Liberals, I was a Liberal at the time, from his national caucus. The Liberals and the Conservatives used to sit in, and the Conservatives still do, senators sit in the national caucus with the leadership. Mr. Scheer would be the leader now, of course, with the Prime Minister, with the leader of the opposition, or the leader of the party, depending on what their status was, and all the elected MPs. So Mr. Trudeau doesn't have that affiliated caucus, although there are 16 Liberals still sitting as a group. That's fine. It's great. So he decided to appoint 3 representatives rather than the leadership of a caucus which he doesn't have. So he appointed the government representative, who's been filled by Peter Harder, Senator Peter Harder, who was one of Mr. Trudeau's first appointees, brilliantly brilliant person, and deputy representative, who is Deanne Belmar, who's a PhD in economics from Quebec, brilliantly brilliant, and then not so much me. I'm the person who would formerly have been called the whip, but as I say, under this new structure, I have nobody to whip and nothing with which to whip them, except my obvious and abundant charm. So it's a difficult situation. It's an interesting situation. And I was talking to my wife Teresa about this speech and telling her just that very line and observation. And she said, "You know, Grant, this kind of reminds me of in our area we'll know about of the Black Knight and the Monty Python's Holy Grail. You know, you're often hacked to pieces, but you remain remarkably perky." Because I got to get this legislation through. The representative group has to get it through, but we don't. As Peter says, we represent the Senate to the government and the government to the Senate. But we emphasize we represent the Senate to the government. So we're not just accepting their legislation and putting it through. We're often involved in negotiating changes and amendments, and I'll get to that at some point. So that's the structure of the relationship, the official relationship. Now because of the changes and the new appointments and so on, there are and retirements. There are 16 senators who sit as Liberals. There are 36 senators who sit as Conservatives, and they all sit in Mr. Scheer's caucus as well. And there are 36 senators who sit as independent senators, and 7 senators who sit as unaffiliated. I would be one of the 7 unaffiliated. So the independents, there's a variety of them. There are 27 who have been appointed by Mr. Trudeau and then Peter Harder, who is sitting as an unaffiliated, the representative group, one of us 3. There are a number who left the Liberal caucus and a number who left the Conservative caucus. So they're a different category, if you would, a different category or description, I should say, of independent. And then there are a number who were already there and never joined a caucus, like Senator McCoy from Calgary. She was a progressive Conservative, never sat with the Conservative caucus, has always essentially been independent. Now a number of the independents, regardless of their background, have come together in a group called the Independent Senators Group, ISG we call it, And so they make up 36. There are 10 vacancies, so very shortly, the independents and the unaffiliated altogether will have very close to a majority. In fact, 36 plus 7 is 43 plus 10 is 53, and that's exactly a majority of 105. So you can see it's changing. Just briefly to talk about the reform options, because Senate reform, electing a Senate, was very, very much on the agenda, the public policy agenda in Alberta. In fact, a lot of the drive for Senate reform, if not almost all of it, came from Alberta. One of the things that struck me most powerfully two things when I went to Ottawa in 2005. One was how complicated this country is to govern. This is a wonderful, remarkable, beautiful, amazing country, and it is complicated to govern, even though there's only 36 million of us. And the second one is just how important the Senate is to smaller provinces in the Atlantic provinces in particular, and to Quebec. And I'll get into that a little bit. But so it isn't immediately obvious that you could reform it in obvious ways. So abolition, the Supreme Court ruling in 2014 made it very clear that you'd need 10 provinces to do that. Back to my point about how important this institution is to Quebec and the Atlantic provinces, it's not likely you're going to get 10. And even to get it elected, you would have to open it up, the Supreme Court ruled, to the second level of constitutional reform initiative, and that would be 7 provinces with 50% or more of the population, and it's very unlikely you're going to get 7 provinces. So that's why you're left with not all that many options for sweeping Senate reform, and I'm going to get into why the one that we have is actually happily and coincidentally the one that we should do. That brings me to another point, which is I'm not sure that the Senate should be abolished. I think the Senate at all. I think, in fact, I'm opposed to it. I think the Senate has done remarkable work, and I'll get into that. And I'm also not convinced that the Senate should be elected, and that's for 3 reasons. One is that it looks like it would, on the face of it, be more democratic. The problem is that, and people don't, I didn't really realize this when I went, the Senate has huge power. We have to pass every piece of legislation, every budget, before it can be implemented or spent. And so every bill that goes through the Senate, or through the House of Commons, 3 stages in committee, goes through the Senate, 3 stages in committee. And sometimes it goes the other way. But the fact of the matter is, the Senate has to say yes. Now, we don't exercise that power, generally. Since 1945, we've only defeated, in total, 6 government bills. We've changed the number, but we've only defeated 6. And so we're really reluctant to defeat bills because we know we're not elected. But let's say we were elected. And let's say, just to make it more interesting, that Canadians actually decided to elect opposition at the Senate level to the whatever the configuration of the House hey, Michael, the House of Commons was. Well, you could have absolute gridlock. You would have impasse. That wouldn't, and what happens in the States? That's essentially what you get. It's very difficult to drive, particularly difficult social policy, but other policies as well. So unless you can figure out a way to break an impasse, and Australia has a way. There are 2 elected chambers, and if they disagree twice on the same issue, there's an automatic election. That gets a politician's attention. We don't have that. So all we have is conferences now, and we try to, and they haven't been used very often or for a long time. The second issue that people don't really appreciate or are just starting to, I think, in a way. I don't mean to be condescending about that. This is really inside baseball. But there was always this feeling in Alberta, and when I was in the legislature, I had to, if only we could get an elected Senate, then, we would have regional representation nirvana, and finally Alberta would have more power in Ottawa because of, the regional representation feature of the Senate. But when you do the numbers, that's not the case. Alberta, the West has 24 senators. Quebec has 24, Ontario has 24, the Maritimes, the Atlantic provinces have 30. So if we actually started to exercise our power, it would be based on a smaller reflection of representation compared to the Atlantic provinces. But what's even more powerful in this argument is that we have 5.7% of the seats in the Senate. That is, Alberta has 5.7% of the seats in the Senate. We have 10% of the seats in the House of Commons. We have much greater regional representation relatively speaking, in the House of Commons than we do in the Senate. So again, if we started to exercise our power, it could be in fact diluted. And just as an aside, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick both have 10 seats, we have 6. And the reason they have 10, of course, is because PEI was so small, it got 4. And then when Newfoundland came in, it got another, we needed to give them some seats, so they got 6 like Alberta, so they now have 30, 24, 24, and 24. So, and finally, I'll make this quick, the other argument is, and this has not been explored, is how electing a Senate would fundamentally restructure the power structure in the country. First of all, take tremendous power away from the Prime Minister, the Cabinet. That may not be all bad. I happen to think we do need to have strong executive power in the sense of managing a very, very difficult country to manage, complicated country to manage, and you get minority governments which can withdraw from that at times, and you get ebb and flow in that power, but you have to be careful about just taking that away. And I like to, in the heat of that debate, I like to kind of kid the MPs that I meet on the plane, and I say, okay, yeah, I think you're right. I think we should elect the Senate. And then what do you think would happen? Because there are 38 or 34 of you, and you represent 1/34 of the province. There are 6 of me, and we represent the whole province. We have a much bigger constituency. Who do you think would have more power? So then I say, just for fun, think about the U.S. situation. What's the most powerful body in the U.S.? I'll bet it's the Senate. And then I say to them, so I say to people, name 5 members of the House of Representatives, which is like in a state which is like our House of Commons. Nancy Pelosi. And then I say, because this is another thing, this is why I think premiers probably don't really want to elect the Senate, because of course they represent regional interests powerfully, and it's a zero-sum game when it comes to power by and large. And so the Senate might absorb a lot of that. So I ask people, how many governors of states do you know in the Senate, in the U.S.? Well, Schwarzenegger. He's retired. So what I'm saying is it could really fundamentally restructure the power structure of this country. And that may be okay, but I think we need to debate it. So all of that is to say it's somewhat moot, because I don't think you get those changes because of the constitutional constraints. 10 provinces to abolish, 7 and 50 to just elect. But all is not lost, and let me get to that. And that's about where we are and what's happened. Someone once said to me, or I read it, you know how it is, a number of years ago, and it was a very powerful, remarkable observation, and that is that the parliamentary system of government is the most powerful system, or most successful system of government on the face of the earth. It has literally lasted hundreds of years. There is no other system of government that exists today that has been as successful. And why is that? It's been successful because it works. And I'd love to get into a discussion of why the parliamentary system. I love the parliament. I love Parliament. I love Canada's parliament. But there's many reasons why it works. And this isn't the most important reason, but it is one of the most important, one significant reason at least, and that's because the Senate exists and it works. In fact, Canada wouldn't exist at all but for the creation of the Senate. It was 6 of 14 days of debate in Charlottetown about creating Canada was focused on the Senate. So the biggest single amount of time was focused on the development of the Senate. Why was that? Because smaller provinces and minorities were afraid that they would be overwhelmed in a larger Canada. And it was the creation of a Senate with regional representation and a focus on a responsibility, particularly explicitly stated, for representing minority interests and regional interests, which was the offering to minorities in smaller provinces. And that's why the Senate existed. The Senate has done remarkable work, and I could spend hours discussing that. But one very, very poignant example is the work that Joyce Fairburn did on illiteracy and literacy. And for 30 years, she worked at that issue and raised that, and she would be one of the most powerful elements in this country, people and advocates in this country, to make it, give it the prominence that it was given. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of the mental health study by Michael Kirby that just blew the lid off the mental health issue in this country. Still have a long way to go, but it was the Senate that was able to do that. And I was actually doing an interview and making the point that the Senate has a couple of advantages, and not to diminish the House of Commons, remarkable, but that we sit longer in the Senate. We generally average about 12 years, 11 or 12 years. They average about 6. And we're not driven by the next election. So we can take on issues that don't even have an identifiable constituency. I mean, Whereas if you're worried about an election in 6 months or 8 months or 10 months, you might be less inclined to do that. I'm not saying that the House of Commons doesn't do remarkable work and remarkable studies, but there is a special, but we're not sort of distracted in some senses to do certain kinds of things, and we can build them over time because we sit there longer as a general rule. So, and we bring institutional memory. So it's done great work, and it's also true that it has, quite apart from me, just remarkable people. Joyce Fairburn is the evidence of that, and you know her and you know her work. One story that I really love to tell, well, Romeo Dallaire was appointed the day I was appointed, and he's spoken to your group. I think it was the biggest crowd you ever had. Well, and just a remarkable person. Another story that I really like to tell is about Senator Lillian Dick. She was appointed the day that I was appointed as well, and Lillian Dick grew up in Saskatchewan with her father was from China, came here to build the railroad, and her mother was Aboriginal. At 12 years old, her mother had, because of the prejudice there, her mother had insisted that she never reveal that she was Aboriginal, interestingly enough, and horrifyingly enough. So people thought she was Chinese, and that, of course, had issues for her as well. By the time she was 12, she was doing calculus for fun, but she was in the slow class because of her ethnic origins and the social relationships around those, if I can be euphemistic about it. And but eventually, she was discovered, as it were, and she went on to get a PhD in biology, and became the vice chair of her department at the University of Saskatchewan. Has had a history of working with Aboriginal women and Aboriginal rights. She's a remarkable person, and she said the night that we were appointed, she never would have been in a parliament ever had it not been for that appointments process. So the Senate is good because it has had remarkable people, and it's provided outstanding, powerful, compelling input to the country for 150 years. So I say now, partly tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, that no matter what you think about the Senate, no matter what you've heard of the Senate, no matter how edgy you feel about that Senate, if the Prime Minister calls, say yes. It's very worthy work. Or now, if there's an opening, apply, because you can apply. So this all begs the question, if it's so good, Grant, you're probably saying, then why is it that we have this intensity to reform it? And the easy answer to that is because of the scandal, and I'm not diminishing the scandal, but I will tell you that I don't believe for a minute that the scandal really tells the whole story. It may be the straw that broke the camel's back. I'll give you an anecdote. I was at a reception in the middle of all of that scandal stuff a number of years ago, and some very aggressive person came up to me and said, you, Senator, you're all like, you and all those other senators are just like those bad senators we're reading about. You're all the same. It's awful. And I said, oh, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? No. So what do you do? Well, I'm a doctor. Oh, I see, you're a doctor, yeah. So are there any bad doctors? Yeah, they're bad doctors. Are you one of them? No. Well, it's like that in the Senate. You know, I don't believe for a minute that thoughtful Canadians will really define this remarkable, beautiful, wonderful institution on the basis of the bad behavior of a minority, a small number of its members. And even if it were just the scandal, even if that were the core issue, presumably it could be fixed by just changing some rules. And the Senate, to its credit, had pretty strong rules, believe it or not, and also has changed them very, very rigorously, opened them up. But would any of you believe that that's enough? I don't. I think the Senate had a much broader, deeper, more profound problem. And that was hopefully not an existential, but almost an existential crisis of credibility. Around the turn of the century, I almost could feel it, but I certainly felt it by the time I reached the Senate. There was a real toxicity creeping into politics in Canada. And it festered for many years and probably still is to some extent, although I think that's being dampened to some extent. And it rolled over, swept over the Senate as well. And I know that. I was part of it, mea culpa. But I began to hear more and more, almost in lockstep with that progression, that Albertans hated politics. They hated political parties, and they were very unhappy with the Senate. And I get partisan politics. I was elected 4 times as a Liberal in Alberta. You know, Michael will tell you that that's a difficult process. But I also know that that when it comes to an elected body, if you don't like the partisanship, you can get rid of the partisans. You can't do that with the Senate. So it's quite a different situation. And then Mr. Trudeau made a remarkable decision. And if you'd asked me, and he removed us Liberal senators from his caucus. If you'd asked me 5 minutes before he did that, I would have said it was the wrong thing to do. The moment he did that, I felt profound relief, and it was a revelation. I am certain in my heart of hearts that sitting in Liberal caucuses as I have done, and I've sat in a number, I was the leader of one, I was never compromised in my values or in my ability to represent my constituents or in my integrity. I was never bullied. I was never intimidated. But in retrospect, after that definitive decision by Mr. Trudeau, I began to realize that in the Senate, as I was speaking about something or doing something, I had in the back of my mind, or sometimes further forward, a calculation, a consideration of what that was going to do to the electoral fortunes of my party on the other side. So if I were to say carbon tax, and I believe we need one, I'm not saying we don't need pipelines, but we need a carbon tax, before Mr. Trudeau said it, he would be subjected to two criticisms, one of two, let's say. One would be, clearly he's a weak leader of a clearly split caucus because he can't control them. Or two, he'd be criticized for believing in a carbon tax which maybe he didn't believe in. Or three, both, as would likely be the case. So, but even if, again, even if this didn't change what I would have done, sitting in, I just realized that it was patently unlikely that I would really be able to convince anybody any longer that sitting in a national Liberal caucus surrounded by very smart, very powerful, very persuasive Liberal leaders and members of Parliament, many of whom were my friends, I just wouldn't, I think, be able to convince anybody that somehow I could distance myself from all of that and sustain an independence from party-driven politics. So that was a key turning point. And then the Supreme Court ruled in 2014 on the Senate reform and reference, something that was that furthered this for me. And that was, it said, the Senate to be effective it was designed to be a complementary body, different from the House of Commons. So, as luck would have it, if you wanted to make the Senate different from the House of Commons, which is elementally partisan, then you would just have to change the partisanship, political party partisanship in the Senate. And as luck would have it, while you can't easily abolish the Senate and you can't easily elect the Senate, there aren't many sweeping changes that you can actually impose. The one, in this case, that I think was integral to meeting Albertans' demands, meeting Canadians' demands for a different kind of Senate, is to do away with partisanship, and you actually can do that. So I'm going to step back one moment and just say, that is not to say that senators who are in Liberal caucuses, the Liberal caucus and the Conservative caucus, don't have a right to do that. They have every right to call themselves whatever they want and to organize however they want. But it still, I think, is their responsibility to answer a key question, implicitly asked by Albertans, explicitly asked by Albertans to some extent, and that is, okay, so you want to have that labeled, but how do you combine that with establishing and maintaining your independence from political party partisanship pressures? And as luck would have it, there are two things that senators can do to achieve that. One is they can stop sitting in their national caucus. And two is they can stop having their own Senate caucus whipped. And I will say that the Liberal caucus conforms to both of those things. They are, in fact, independent. So what have we done to change things beyond the status of the Liberals in that respect? Well, as I've said, there's now this group that I'm part of, appointed by the Prime Minister, and we have no government caucus. So we can't count numbers and know we're going to win a vote. It is very, very nerve-wracking, which brings me to the Black Knight, because I'm the person who's now called the liaison who, by relationships, has to create support for government bills. Two, there is a more objective process, and that is anybody can apply, and there's a body that I could get into the detail of that reviews and gives the Prime Minister 5 recommendations for each position. So I'm not saying it gets better senators. I think there have been remarkable senators. But I am saying it gets senators who are not tainted by the burden of a process that many people, if not all people, saw as inside and secretive and driven by party loyalty. Thirdly, Mr. Trudeau has appointed only senators who declare their independence, and by definition, none of them have joined a party-labeled caucus. And fourthly, rules have been changed both to tighten up expenses reviews and to create greater transparency and reporting and so on to the public. And rules have also been changed to bring independent senators up to an equality with all the other senators, although we still have further to go in that respect. And then there's the Liberals who are, for all intents and purposes, independent as well. So I'll conclude. I've got 5 minutes, okay? And because I've been told that if I don't go right up to 30, there's going to be elevator music instead of me, so I could sing. So I'm not going to say that the Senate is now doing better work, because the Senate has always done exceptionally good work. I will say, however, and I mean with great conviction, that because of these changes, I believe that the Senate's credibility is beginning to improve, and as I hope you would agree, you'll tell me after lunch, after dessert, so you'll be happy, that the Senate's credibility is enhanced. At the very least, you're not reading about disappointment and scandal very often. What you really are reading about is strong work done by great senators on behalf of Canadians and Albertans, and I think that's a remarkable breakthrough. I will also say that some interesting statistics, it's too early to tell right now, but about in the history of since 2004, between 2004 and 2015, so before the changes occurred, 21 of 366 government bills were amended successfully, i.e. amended and accepted by the House of Commons, by the government, out of 366. So 5.7% of the bills over that period were amended successfully by the Senate. Since the changes, about a year and a half, not even a year and a half, actually, 5 of 35 bills have been amended successfully already, so that's 14%. We've over doubled that. And then when you get to senator bills, because senators can actually initiate bills, many people don't realize that, it's about, it was 13 in the 14 years that in the 11 years that I mentioned, 2004 to 2015, and it's been 6 in the last year. So we're almost, I don't know what that is, but we're certainly upping the pace. And the government's been very open to senator bills and to amendments, and we've worked very, very closely to do that. So there's still a way to go. In particular, the biggest jump will be to make these changes irreversible. And I think that the key thing, and this is provocative, but the Conservatives senators need to no longer sit in their elected caucus. And that will create a definitive moment which will be very, very politically difficult, insurmountable to reverse. It's also true that if people like you, Canadians, Albertans, like what you see in a reformed Senate, the changes in the Senate, that can build public pressure, and all parliamentarians can become aware of that, and I think they are more and more, and it will become increasingly difficult to reverse that. In conclusion, I will say that I'm not here to say that, as I said, the Senate that the issue really is to make the Senate better. I know it's our fault, nobody knows it, but the Senate has been really good, generally. The key is that the Senate needs to be effective to do its work on behalf of Canadians, and to be effective, it needs to be credible. And I think we're making changes to get us down that road. We have a way to go, but we're making progress, and it's a remarkable time in the history of this beautiful, wonderful, remarkable institution. Thanks very much.